The Laboo toy Peppa found a strange toy in an old chest in the attic. A small figure with big dark eyes and a wide smile. It had a tag, Laboo. The toy was soft but cold to the touch, as if it had been kept in a freezer for a long time. "Can I take it to my room?" Peppa asked Mummy Pig. "Of course, dear. But wash it first, it's very dusty." Peppa took Laboo to her room and placed it on the shelf next to her other toys. The toy stared straight ahead with an unmoving gaze. Something about its smile seemed wrong, too wide for such a small face. At night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound, quiet rustling, as if someone was crawling on the floor. She turned on the nightlight and looked around the room. Everything was in its place, but Laboo had disappeared from the shelf. "Where is it?" Peppa muttered, getting out of bed. She found the toy under the bed, lying on its side. Strange! How could it have gotten there? Peppa picked up Laboo and put it back on the shelf. The toy seemed heavier than before, and its smile had become even wider. The next day, Peppa was playing with George in the living room. Suddenly, she heard the patter of little feet upstairs. "Mummy, someone's walking in my room," Peppa said. "There's no one there, dear. Maybe it's mice." But when Peppa went up to her room, Laboo was not on the shelf again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the room, turned toward the door. Its pose was as if it had been waiting for Peppa. "How did you get here?" Peppa whispered, carefully approaching the toy. Laboo was silent, but its eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. The girl quickly grabbed the toy and put it back on the shelf, but this time turned it to face the wall. At night, the rustling repeated, but now it was louder. Peppa woke up and saw that Laboo was standing by her bed, looking straight at her. In the darkness, its eyes glowed with a faint greenish light. "What do you want from me?" Peppa whispered, not daring to move. The toy didn't answer, but slowly raised one hand, as if it wanted to touch Peppa. The girl screamed and turned on the light. Laboo instantly became an ordinary toy lying on the floor. "Mummy! Daddy! What happened?" asked Mummy Pig, running into the room. "Laboo! It was moving! It was standing by my bed! It's just a toy, dear. It can't move." But Peppa saw the truth in Laboo's dark eyes. The next day, she tried to throw the toy away, but it kept returning to her room. First in the trash can, then in the garden, even when Peppa took it to the neighbors. Laboo always found its way back. It began appearing in the most unexpected places. In Peppa's school bag, in the refrigerator, even in the bathroom. Each time its smile became wider and its eyes brighter. One night, Peppa woke up and found that all her toys had lined up in a row, looking at the bed. And in the center stood Laboo, like a commander of an army. "Now you understand," whispered a voice that seemed to come from all the toys at once. "I'm not just a toy, I'm a collector. And now, you're part of my collection." Peppa wanted to scream but couldn't move. Her body was becoming stiffer, like a toy. She felt her skin turning to plastic and her thoughts slowing down. "Don't worry," said Laboo, coming closer. "Being a toy isn't so bad. You'll play forever. With me." In the morning, Mummy Pig found a new toy in Peppa's room, very similar to her daughter. It stood on the shelf next to Laboo, with the same wide smile and motionless gaze. "Strange, I don't remember buying this toy," Mummy Pig muttered, adjusting the little dress of the toy Peppa, and Laboo stood nearby, its smile even wider. Now it had a friend, forever. But Laboo's collection wasn't complete yet. In the evening, it heard George playing in the next room. It was time to find a new friend. A gift for George. George really wanted a new toy. His favorite dinosaur had broken, and the boy was sad all day long. Mummy Pig decided to cheer up her son and took him to a new toy store on the outskirts of town. The store was strange. Dim lighting, creaky shelves, and the shopkeeper, An elderly pig with cloudy eyes spoke very quietly, almost in a whisper. "Choose any toy, dear," said Mummy Pig. George wandered between the shelves, looking at bright toys, but his gaze was drawn to one special figure in the far corner, a small creature with big dark eyes and a wide smile. The tag read Laboo. "I want this one," said George, pointing at the toy. The shopkeeper looked strangely at the boy, then at Mummy Pig. "Are you sure? This toy is special. It requires special care." "What do you mean?" asked Mummy Pig. "Nothing special, just be attentive to the child's behavior." Mummy Pig shrugged and bought Laboo. George was delighted. He hugged the toy to himself all the way home, and Laboo seemed to look directly at him with her motionless eyes. At home, George immediately ran to his room to play with the new toy. He sat Laboo on the bed and began telling her about his favorite games. "You'll be my best friend," said George. And then it seemed to him that Laboo nodded slightly. The first few days everything was normal. George played with Laboo, carried her everywhere, even slept, hugging her. But gradually his behavior began to change. First, George became very quiet. He stopped running around the house, shouting and laughing. Instead, he sat for hours in his room, quietly talking to Laboo. "Who are you talking to in there?" asked Peppa, peeking in on her brother. "With Laboo. She tells me interesting stories." "But it's just a toy, George." "No, she's real. She talks to me." Peppa looked at the toy. Laboo sat on the bed with the same wide smile, but something about her pose seemed wrong to Peppa, as if the toy was watching her. Then George began saying strange things. He told his parents about a dark forest where Laboo lived, about other children who played there forever. He said that Laboo showed him this world in dreams. "I like it there," George said with a distant look. "It's always dark and quiet there. And no one shouts." His parents became worried. George began avoiding sunlight, preferring to sit in dark corners. He stopped eating his favorite food and barely slept at night. One night, Mummy Pig heard George talking in his room. She quietly approached the door and listened. "Yes, Laboo, I understand. I want to stay with you forever. Your world is much better." Mummy Pig entered the room. George sat on the bed holding Laboo in his hands. His eyes were wide open, but his gaze was empty, as if he was looking through his mother. "George, who are you talking to?" "With Laboo. She says she'll take me to her place soon. We'll play in her world where it's always night." Mummy Pig felt a chill. She took Laboo from her son's hands. The toy was ice cold, even though George had been holding it in his warm hands. "I think you need to rest from this toy for a while," said Mummy, and took Laboo to another room. George screamed like never before. He cried and begged to return Laboo, said he couldn't live without her. At night, Mummy Pig woke up to a strange sound, quiet footsteps in the corridor. She left the bedroom and saw George walking toward the room where Laboo lay. The boy moved strangely, like a sleepwalker. His eyes were closed. "George!" called Mummy, but the boy didn't react. He reached the room, took Laboo, and returned to his room. In the morning, he didn't remember how it happened. The parents decided to get rid of the toy. They took Laboo back to the store, but the shopkeeper only smiled mysteriously. "She'll return," he said. "They always return to their children." And indeed, the next day, Laboo was back in George's room. No one knew how she got there. Each day, George became more distant. He almost stopped talking to his family, spending all his time with Laboo. His skin became pale, and his eyes lost their shine. One morning, the parents went into George's room to wake him up, but the bed was empty. Only Laboo lay on the pillow with her unchanging smile. George was nowhere to be found. The search continued for weeks, but the boy seemed to have vanished into thin air, and Laboo remained in the house, waiting for the next child who would want to play with her. Peppa Pig, the Forgotten Friend, and Laboo. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, Peppa and Lucy. Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Laboo, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Laboo was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Laboo sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Laboo. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Laboo, knew where Peppa had gone. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him. "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices, even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. There were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches. Its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise!" whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled. as if two more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside. It all began with a small scratch on George's arm. He hurt himself while playing in the yard, and no one paid much attention. Mummy cleaned the wound. Daddy said it would heal by morning. But by the next morning, nothing had changed. More than that, Peppa noticed George had become different. He didn't laugh, didn't ask to play dinosaurs, didn't run after her in the garden. Instead, he sat by the window, staring off into the distance. His little fingers twisted a toy absent-mindedly, but his eyes, they were empty, as if he wasn't looking outside at all, but falling inward into endless darkness. "George," Peppa called softly. He turned his head slowly, and a smile flickered on his lips. But it wasn't her brother's smile. There was no warmth, no joy in it. It was something foreign. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. With each passing day, George grew quieter. He ate less and less, even refused his favorite ice cream. His skin paled, shadows deepened under his eyes. And one evening, Peppa caught a strange smell. It came from George, damp earth, mold, as if he had spent hours lying in some wet basement. She tried to tell their parents. "Something's wrong with George, he's scaring me." But Mummy only stroked her head. "Don't make things up, darling. George is just tired." Peppa knew. It wasn't tiredness. That night, a faint sound woke her. A soft scratching, like claws dragging across the floorboards. Peppa slowly sat up in bed and saw George. He was standing in the darkness in the middle of the room, motionless. Moonlight fell across his face, and his eyes reflected it, so that they looked completely white. "George?" Peppa whispered. He didn't answer, only tilted his head slightly and smiled again. The next few days were a nightmare for her. She was afraid to be alone with him. His presence made the air cold, as if he carried dampness into the house. Sometimes Peppa thought he had stopped breathing altogether. He sat still like a doll, and only minutes later would he take one long, heavy breath. And then, one night, what she feared most happened. A dull thud woke her. Peppa opened her eyes and saw George. He was lying on the floor, his body twisting as if something inside was breaking him apart. Two dark bulges pushed through his back with a sickening crack. They grew, tore through, and within moments became wings. Enormous, leathery, black. Peppa screamed, but no sound came out. George lifted his head. His hands were no longer hands. Long claws scraped against the floor. From his mouth came an inhuman cry. "I'm not George anymore!" A violent gust of wind shattered the window. With one beat of his new wings, George shot upward. Glass rained down. Wind roared into the room. Peppa shielded her face. When she dared to look again, her brother was gone. On the floor lay his toy dinosaur, smeared with black slime that spread slowly across the boards. Peppa collapsed onto the bed and wept. She didn't know where to run, what to do. Her parents, it seemed, hadn't even stirred from the noise. The next morning, no one spoke of George. His chair at the table was empty, but Mummy and Daddy acted as if it had always been so. "Where's George?" Peppa asked desperately. Mummy looked at her calmly. "We've only ever had you, Peppa." Those words struck harder than the nightmare itself. She realized George wasn't just gone physically. His very memory was being erased. But Peppa remembered. A few nights later, a knock woke her. Soft, deliberate, against the window. She slowly opened her eyes and saw him. George, but not him. His face was elongated. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Wings stretched behind him. blocking out the moonlight. His mouth opened, and from it came a whisper, "You're next, Peppa." She tried to scream, but her throat closed and no sound escaped. And then she saw Laboo. He was sitting on the windowsill. His eyes burned red. His smile was wider than ever. The toy shook his head slowly, as if saying, "I can't help you." Peppa pressed her hooves to her face, her heart pounding wildly. She knew then, George was only the beginning. Laboo was not there to protect her. He was part of this nightmare, and now he was waiting.